I had so much to say about our last week's discussion. I thought there were just like so many good points, and I took all these notes. And then I realized that if I talked about everything that I was going to say, we'd end up with like 3 hours of a talking head video, which I didn't think was going to be particularly helpful. So I've actually decided that for this week's discussion video, I'm going to focus on two particular comments that I think would be really helpful, kind of one carrying us over and thinking about moving us into the next module, and then another that I think is just like sort of an important issue. So for the first topic, which is about sort of thinking about too how we're sort of carrying our conversation into this issue of the impact of digital technology on the publishing industry, I wanted to talk more, to kind of dig deeper into this idea about sort of discoverability and browsing and how we buy books. I agree that I don't usually like Amazon's book recommendations. I actually do like Amazon's recommendation system for other things, so I think I kind of rely on it for things like gardening tools. Cookbooks actually are good, so I suppose that's a bracketing thing. And then also my son's school supplies. It's like back to school season, right? But I'm not generally impressed with Amazon's book recommendations. Like they're sort of like what to buy or, recommended for you. I find those recommendations often kind of lame. And I think that's really interesting because Amazon started with books, but I don't think they come anywhere close to the help or advice that a public librarian could give you, especially one who might have a background in reader's advisory. I think that may have something to do with what's going on in the algorithm and also just like the number of books. But certainly I think something like Goodreads does a lot better job of identifying similar titles. And there, they seem to be relying a lot more on sort of like constructing relevance and similarity on the basis of certain kinds of social qualities, as opposed to certain kinds of metadata about the books themselves. And I think that's a really interesting point as well. I will say I think Amazon is getting better with respect to children's books, but I actually have a worry or a wonder whether that has a lot to do with the fact that there are a lot of programs like Accelerated Reader that educators and sort of like people have it's like there's a lot of investment from education into these programs that create really rich metadata to help recommend and sort of grade books. So that like schools can say, oh, like if your child read this, then they should read this, and like here's the level that it's at, and here's like the topics that it has, right? So there's just a lot more, and it seems to be more educationally focused. But then I wonder if people are sort of using that information to buy books on Amazon, whether in some sense a lot of those preferences and choices end up sort of like getting built into the back end on Amazon. In which case, it's not really about Amazon's recommendation system exactly, except that it sort of manages to track the purchases of people who are using another system. So I do think it's better for kids' books, but, I'm not really sure quite what's going on the back end there. Just to take a step back, I think Amazon, as Thompson describes it, there's just like this interesting role as like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And like many of you, I also buy books from the local shops. So I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, and so my go-tos are either going to be Bookman's or, and we have a local Bookman's here, just like in Tucson, or there's like a local independent bookshop called Brightside. And so I don't mind paying more in the case of Brightside just to have a local shop. And of course, I really like buying used books as well, too. So I kind of the Bookman's and the independent shop are sort of my primary places for a lot of the book buying that I do. But the problem is that they don't always have what I want, right? And I am an impatient creature. So if I go to a bookstore and I go to Brightside and I'm like, hey, I want to get the book Three Women. It's like a big book this summer. And they're like, we just sold our last copy yesterday. So sorry. And I'm like, They're like, well, we can order it for you. And I'm like, well, when will it come in? And they're like, well, it probably... And the moment they say probably, I'm like, no, I'm not doing this. What's going to happen is that if I want the book, I am either going to order the print copy via Prime, which I'll either get in 1 or 2 days, or I'm going to just go ahead and buy it on my Kindle and read it on my phone. I'm a little embarrassed to say that I do that because I feel like I ought to have more of a commitment to Bookman's and the sort of local shops. But I think that I am not alone in this, right? And I think that's really been why places like Amazon and why digital technology has really taken off and kind of had been this disruptive force for the book, the publishing industry. It's because of their supply chain, their powers of distribution, where you can get what you want and you can get it almost immediately. It's they're really, in the case of an ebook, it's practically instant gratification that you can get what you want. And so I think that's been this really interesting change into how people buy books and sort of what their expectations are. So for now, I just want to point out that the distribution is fast, and that's what I think has made them incredibly dominant. But I'd also like to point out that I'm also a little disillusioned with at least the sort of structure of Amazon's recommendation systems. I guess I just sort of would have thought that their actual recommendation system would be better, but perhaps that's just me. The next topic that I want to talk about is just focusing on something that I think is really important and I think connects to this idea about why is it that we care about the history of publishing? We've talked about this, but why does it matter? And I think when we're thinking about some of the discussions that we've had lately, particularly the one between Sydney and Fallon about this issue of preservation, it really touches these questions about what gets published, what gets collected, why, who has access to it, right? So I think for me, this is sort of really touching on the issue about why it is that we sort of want to find out the details. It's because we're also really interested in other kinds of questions about the values that are involved or how we're thinking about things and sort of why it matters. Listening to Sydney and Fallon's comments, I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that while there are so many different perspectives on the issue about why preservation could or should or shouldn't be valuable, all of them are so richly informed by different kinds of experiences. And so people come to these really oppositional in some sense. I mean, it doesn't need to necessarily be antagonistic, but they come to really different stances on this on the basis of really different lived experiences. I think the problem is that there's not really this one way to conceptualize access to information and why it's valuable. And I guess on some views we could think about access to information. It's always a good thing, right? The more access to information, the better, because information is going to be empowering and it's going to be liberating. And I think that view is, it's a really liberal view. It's really sort of, I think, in some sense, really entrenched in the history of librarianship. But we're also coming to recognize that there are other views about the value of information where information is a little bit more like a gift. It's something that you earn or that can sort of mark you or sort of change who you are in important ways. So it's like a secret handshake. And the point of some sort of special secret handshake is that I mean, like the point is that only some people know it, and that like knowing it kind of creates like this sort of special in-group, out-group kind of thing. But if everybody knows it, you could still use the secret handshake, but it doesn't perform the same functional role anymore. And so in that sense, you've kind of broken it. I think what's going on here in some sense is that like we have to figure out how to navigate these different kinds of views and make sure that like people are heard. I don't think that's impossible at all, but one of the things that I really wanted to point out, and I really wanted to tie into this thing about that Jesse was saying about the ways in which libraries are just getting kind of squeezed by different kinds of commercial forces. And I think that's right. But I think it's really important to protect libraries. Like when we talk about what the value of libraries are, one thing that we could say is that, well, they're not just places to access information. They're also places where we have conversations about who gets to access information. And because we sort of hope that libraries are in some sense kind of a little bit separated or have a little bit of space from certain kinds of commercial pressures, it's a little bit easier for everybody to have a seat at the table or to have conversations about who should have a seat at the table. So I think libraries and other cultural heritage institutions are really uniquely situated to have these kinds of conversations. And yet, when we sort of think about the history of publishing, we can also see how there are all these commercial forces that are kind of coming down and like creating a lot of pressure on the institutions in ways that we can kind of understand. And I think the more you can understand those pressures, the more you can have conversations about why it's still really important and what kind of value libraries are sort of providing today.